We're going to I just want to kind of chat through some of the stuff we're doing as we talk about being externally focused and what that's meant for our church. And I want to step you through some things that we're working on now. And what will help me is this. I just want to get a feel. How many of you were here last year when we talked about getting in the stream and all of that? That'll just help me put it in context so that I don't want to do a big repeat of some of those concepts, just to kind of get us into that and started. I shared with our leadership team at our church 2 years ago that I have helped our church transition 2 times without killing it, and I think I have a third one in me before we're done. And what we're working towards is how does our church get more engaged in our neighborhoods? And so let me back up and take you back for me 20 years when I started there at LifeBridge. Our church was downtown church in a small community of about 65,000 folks. 6 weeks after I arrived, the church celebrated their 100th anniversary. So it had been in the community a long time. And the first transition we worked on was we moved from a more traditional model and I didn't have words for it at the time. I didn't have language around this. Look back and you hear the words and you attach it. But we moved from a more traditional model to a more attractional model. In other words, we started looking for ways to get people to come to church. We started focusing on people who didn't go to church. And so we opened up a lot of side doors, ministries like so many of you have experienced here at Shofar and have heard other speakers talk about from their churches. So we did a lot of recovery kinds of things. We did a lot of stuff with children and students. We tried to make it so that people who had never been to church would have some connection. Now, what we simply did was find ways to invite our friends and create that. And here's what happened. Our church started growing. We went from a few hundred to just under 1,000, and then 1,500, and almost 2,000. And almost all of those folks, about 85%, were people who were coming to Christ. And honestly, as our church was growing and we were doing all of that, I should have been feeling really good about all of that. But here was my concern. I was looking at what we were doing, and I was recognizing that while our church was growing, and that was a good thing, we really weren't having much of an impact in our community around us. There wasn't really any way that I saw our community being different somehow. So it started leading to a question, and the question was this. If our church disappeared, would anybody care? If the congregation we were a part of, our church, not the building, not where we were meeting, but the people, if the church were gone, nuked out of the community somehow, would anybody notice? Would anybody care? And as we started delving down on that question, digging down on it, what we discovered was we didn't really think so. We thought they might miss some of our programs. We did this big Christmas event, and the last year we did it, we had 32,000 people show up for it. That's a lot of folks to come to an event. We had some children's things that were well attended. We did a lot of stuff that we saw people participate in, but I'm not sure there was any real difference. And that led us to make a second transition. And so what we were saying first was, hey, come to us. Find ways to get folks in our doors. And we did a lot of stuff to that. We bring in guest speakers and things somebody they'd seen, maybe who'd come to Christ on, but with some national name. And again, those things were good for us. It attracted what I would call kind of the crowd people showing up. And it did give us a chance to talk to people about the relationship, and people were coming to Christ. What moved us, though, was what would happen if we went to them. What would it look like if we got engaged? And so let me use this illustration. And you were here last year. And when we first wrote about this a number of years ago, I had no idea it was going to come so true in our community in the last week. We talked about getting in the stream that was going by our front door. What I didn't know was the stream was going to come to us. And it did last week in a big way. But as we talked about getting in the stream, here's what I saw. As Christians, we didn't like what was happening in the stream going by our front door, did we? We don't like what's happening in our schools. We didn't like what was happening in government. We didn't like what was happening in policies. There was a lot of stuff. So in the States, and I know the same thing has happened here in South Africa, we created Christian versions of all that stuff. We didn't like what was happening in public schools, and so we started our own Christian schools, private schools. We didn't like what was happening in business organizations, so we started our own Christian business clubs. We didn't like what was going on in music, and so we started our own Christian music industry. There was a lot of stuff we started, and here's what we did accidentally. By disengaging from that stream, we disengaged from the ability to speak into the fabric of our community. Let me over-illustrate it, and I did this last year, but let me over-illustrate it this way. We didn't like what was happening in the public school, so we started our own Christian schools. We took Christian kids and Christian parents and Christian teachers and Christian bus drivers and lunchroom staff and administrators and coaches, and we pulled them out of the public school. And in essence, we said to the public school, go to hell. Now, I realize that's an overstatement, but we lost our ability to speak into the fabric of our public schools. Now, I get why we have Christian schools. We have 2 in our city. We have folks from our church whose kids are participating in that. We have some folks from our church who teach and lead in those 2 Christian schools. And I get the values that get taught there. I get the reason why we do that. But here's what we've inadvertently done. We have backed up and backed up and backed up and backed up and backed up. And we no longer have the ability to speak into what's happening in our communities. And so what we've done is we've gotten to the edge of the stream and we've shouted at the water. You're going the wrong way. You're doing the wrong stuff. You're headed in the wrong direction. And here's the problem. They really can't hear us anymore. Because there's so many voices calling for their attention. There's so much distraction today. There is so much bombarding people. And so as a church, we said, what would happen if we got involved in the stream going by the front door? So the way we say it now is we were doing missional stuff before missional was cool. We didn't have a word name for it. We didn't know what we were doing with that. But we did make choices to get involved. And so as a church, instead of starting a Christian school, we got involved in the public schools in our community. Today, we provide 85% of the mentors for at-risk kids in our public school system. Our volunteers from our church. We run 7 aftercare programs in the public school district at their request for schools that they find are struggling in some way with students. We have discovered a number of ways to connect into our public schools. And for us, that's been a huge opportunity to have a voice. Last Sunday morning, the superintendent of our school district, who is not a believer, but he is genuinely a good person who wants to see our students in our school get a solid education and be treated well. He's a tremendous individual. I'm working on him on the faith stuff. We talk about it all the time. But last week, in the midst of our community flood, Don came to our services and provided some support and information to the parents whose kids had been displaced. Their schools are now underwater, and what's going to happen. But Don was with us to simply say, thanks for your engagement. And so now we're going to be helping with how kids are going to be doing schooling over the next 90 days in our area. We said, what would happen if we got involved with helping at-risk families? And so we got involved doing stuff for single moms. And currently, there are over 400 single moms who are connected to our church. We have talked to local university and community college in our city to provide free education to any mom wanting to upgrade her job skills. We work with childcare. We work with transportation, providing vehicles for these ladies, opportunities for them to break a pattern that has created for them such a downward spiral in so many ways. In America, the single fastest growing household are single parent households. 97% of those are led by single moms, and they are incredibly stressed. And so as a church, we said, let's figure out ways to get engaged with those. Here's a very cool thing that happens. Because of all the mentoring and all the partnering we do, we also get to connect with them at a lot of levels spiritually. A couple of weekends ago, we did a baptism event, with the pools out in our parking lot, and about half the people coming to Christ that day were these single moms. And how is that happening? Because somebody came alongside and connected with them. One of our staff members several years ago was praying with his girls. They were doing a devotional book, and they got to the section in the Bible where it said you should pray for widows and orphans. And so they started praying for widows. We could think of some in our church, he said, but I didn't really know any orphans because in the U.S. we don't have orphanages anymore. But that led them to be praying about this. And he said, and in an incredible way, God opened up some doors for them to think about foster care. And so they went through the foster care training and became foster care parents. And that led them to asking us at our church, is there anything we could do with foster care? And so we went to, in Boulder County, the lady who runs Child Protective Services in Boulder County is easily one of the most liberal people I know. And in my part of the world, that takes some doing. She's a terrific-hearted person, but she is what we call an ABC person. Anything but church. For her, she's good with anything, but not the church. And so we went to her and we said, do you think there's anything our church could do to help with the foster care situation? And she said, no, I don't see anything. I don't see any way that would be helpful. But one of her associates said, well, we need to host a community meeting and do some training and invitation so people know what foster care is about. Maybe they would host one for us. And we did, and we hosted that. That was 9 years ago. Today, our church provides over half of the foster care homes in our county. We have 2 members from our staff who are no longer on our staff who are driving foster care adoption for the state of Colorado. In other words, there are kids whose parents they are completely freed from for a number of reasons. 2 years ago, that was 1,800 kids were eligible for adoption. Today, there are 283 kids left out of that 1,800 who need to find a permanent family. And that's happened because of the faith community in Colorado. Our church initially got involved, but these 2 members now, the state of Colorado pays us to employ them to go around to the counties in the state of Colorado and get other churches to figure out ways to get engaged in the foster care system in their county. And now there are 3 other states who have called and asked for us to bring that same kind of assistance to them. Here was a cool thing. We're working alongside people of goodwill. So our line would be people of faith working alongside people of goodwill. And we care about some of the same issues. And so they came up with this slogan. They want to have more homes available than kids who need a home. In other words, so no kid waits for a home. And that number changes all the time. A meth lab gets busted in our community, and now you've got a half a dozen children who are now needing foster care, either on a temporary or some kind of long-term basis. So the number goes up and down of the kids who need foster care. But last year, she sent a letter to us explaining what had happened in a meeting with her co-workers around the state, all of the directors of Child Protective Services for each county in Colorado. And she said, I stood up in the meeting and I told them, we've had something happen that we've never have had happen in our 35-year history of Child Protective Services in Boulder County. She said, for 1 quarter, we had more homes available than we had kids who needed a home. And then she said this, and I have no idea exactly why, but there's this church in Longmont that's been helping us with this. And here's what's happened. I've watched her start showing up. She shows up at our services now sometimes. She started asking questions about faith. She's not a believer at this point, but she is a believer that somehow the church can be engaged in the issues going on around her. We just made a decision to get in the stream. That started 16 years ago for us. We've been doing that for a while. Here's the transition that we're working on right now at the moment. So first it was come to us, attractional. How do we get people here? And then it was missional. What if we go to them? And we've been doing that. And now we're saying, what would happen if we were just with them? What would happen if we were incarnational? What would happen if folks in our church actually didn't see that church was simply about something they came to, but something they were? What would happen if they saw it not as a one-day-a-week thing they were a part of, but something that was transformative for them in their lives? What would happen if we could get folks we talk about being good neighbors. What would happen if they were just the best neighbor their neighbor ever had? What would that look like for them? And so we started working on this a couple of years ago, and here's what we're finding. How do we push ministry kind of down and out? One of the struggles that I see coming for our churches in America is this. Today, in every way we measure church attendance in America is as low as it has been in the 40 years they've been measuring nationwide attendance. In the 1980s, if you said, I'm a sold-out, committed follower of the Shofar Church in Stellenbosch, in the U.S., here's what that meant. It meant that you came 3 out of 4 weekends a year, that you showed up almost every weekend. In the 90s, the late 90s, it was 2 out of 4. Today, it is 1.4 weekends a month. That's for the active people. Rick Warren is right when he says we preach to a parade. There's just a constant flow of people going by. A lot of believers in America today now attend several churches. They go to one church for worship and they plug in with another church because they like their small groups or some program they have, and maybe they serve with a congregation down the road. They're active in a number of places. In other words, I just talked to a good friend of mine who came to Christ about 10 years ago, and he attends our church, and he started connecting with another church, which I've said to him, boy, if they're feeding you, if that's what you need to do, go do that. But here's what's going on for you, Lou, right now. Sometimes you're there and sometimes you're here, and one, there's no accountability for you, and two, we have no idea where you are. What we're discovering in the U.S. is that 78% of church growth is simply swapping around. In other words, a lot of church growth talk is about how do we be the best church in our community? How is it we could be the best church in our community? Here's what we mean. How do we have the best worship and the best preaching and the best kids stuff and the best student ministries? And how do we have the best college age stuff going on? How do we be the best? How do we be the most attractional place in town? And don't get me wrong, I hope we're still attractional. I still want us to do a good job. I still want people in our community to say, hey, we should go connect up there. There's stuff they're doing that I need. I want to be a part of. Don't misunderstand. I still hope people are coming this weekend in Longmont. But we shifted the question. That led to this question was, what would happen if we were the best church for our community? What does that look like? And it gets answered differently than being the best church in the community. For us, it was a reorientation on how we were staffing. It was looking differently at some of the programming that we were doing. And so here are some of the shifts. And we're a long ways from this. And I'm honestly, I have no idea if we're going to fail or succeed at this, and it's messy for us right now. But we have said, what would happen if we really focused more intentionally and became more people-centric than program-centric? What would happen if we pushed ministry down and out into our neighborhoods? What would happen if we put as much emphasis on scattering as we have on our gathering? In the U.S., I don't know what that number would be here for you, but in the U.S., 65% of the resources of the average church is spent on the weekend. In other words, we put a lot of energy into our weekend. We have 5 services. We got a lot of stuff going on in our services. There's a lot of energy and activity around that. And we've said, what would happen if we focused as much on scattering as we did on gathering? And so we're moving to a more neighborhood model for us. And again, I don't have all of this defined, but let me give you some drivers that have been working for us. Jesus was asked one time, what is the greatest commandment? And we all know the answer that he gives, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. Matthew chapter 22. Love God with everything you have. And that's a tough one to follow, isn't it? To love God with every fiber of our being is not so easy, because sometimes we love other stuff more than we love God, don't we? Sometimes it's relationships, sometimes our work, sometimes our family, sometimes it's our hobbies. There's a lot of things we love. I mean, I love God, but I love Italian food as well. I love God, but I love the Denver Broncos in our football team. There's a lot of things I love. How do you love God with everything? That's a tough challenge for us. And then Jesus said, that second commandment is what? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. So those two things. So as a church, we've been saying, what would happen if we focused around those two things? What would happen if we helped people love God a little better today than they did yesterday? And what would happen if we helped them love their neighbor a little better today than they did yesterday? What would that mean if we were to love God and love our neighbors? And so that's kind of the central driver to everything that we have been talking about as a church. Love God and love your neighbor, kind of core to what we're doing. Now, for years, we've been saying this, that we want to help people discover grace, grow in grace, and live gracefully. Ephesians 2:8-9 says, for by grace we've been saved through our faith, and that not of ourselves is a gift from God, not of works that any one of us should boast. And we love this idea of God's forgiveness and his acceptance and how he brings us to himself. And here's what we would say. If Ephesians 2:8-9 is true for you, it may not be true for you yet, but if it is true for you, then so is verse 10. And I end up getting to speak with a lot of pastors, and we'll quote Ephesians 2:8-9, and boy, we just can boom that out. And then I say, let's quote verse 10, and we kind of mumble through it, and I'm a little surprised, because verse 10 is so much linked to verse 8 and 9. For verse 10 says this, for we are God's workmanship, created in Christ to do good things that God prepared in advance for us to do. In other words, that God has something for everybody to do. There's a part of his story he's counting on us writing. And so one of our jobs is to figure out, how do we help the people in our church connect with that part of the story, with the good things that God has prepared for them to do. And so here's what we've said. We want to invite you to serve, because I don't think you grow until you serve. And where you serve doesn't matter. Whether you serve inside our church or outside our church doesn't matter to us. Let's say you're a little league coach. You're coaching little kids in some sport. How is it that could be a kingdom thing for you? How is it that God could use that in your life? Maybe you're volunteering to work someplace. How is it that you use that for you? How about some hobby you have? How about taking that hobby and using it to make a difference? How do we help people discover grace, come to know God's grace in their life, grow in that grace, and then live gracefully? How is that showing up? And so those have been words we've been using for a long time. So here's an illustration we've gone to try to describe where we've been at and I'm not sure where I left on the slides here. So do you want to jump up a couple for me? So if we help people discover, grow, and live in grace, how is that happening? How are we making that happen? And here's the shift we're working on right now. Because we recognize that people don't just do the stair-step thing. I wish they would. I wish people would come to our 101 class and then our 201 and 301. But people don't live like that, do they? They really live in this kind of journey thing that's happening. And so here's how we perceive it going forward. We want to help people with that connection piece in their life. One, how are they connecting with God? And then how are they connecting with others? And I think if you'll roll up one more for me. One more slide. How is it we're helping people connect first with God and then with others? And so about 4 months ago, we did a very simple thing with the believers in our church already, the people who are already part of our church. One, we divided our community and the other communities around us into just kind of geographical boundary neighborhoods. They're not hard to find that way. And we took people from our staff and some of our key leaders in our church, and we have them as neighborhood pastors in a certain neighborhood. So I live in the northwest part of my city, and there is a northwest Longmont neighborhood pastor, and his first job was to try to connect with the families, the people there. And then we went to some folks and we said, hey, what would happen if we just got connected with the people who are already a part of our church family? We're not even talking about connecting with disconnected people yet. What if we just gathered the people in our church together a little better? So in my neighborhood where I live, there are about 350 families that have some connection to our church. Some really deep connections, others maybe they've been there once or twice, we've seen them for something, but no strong connection. And we went and we asked some families, we would like for you to host some people in your home. This won't be their small group. This isn't their discipleship. This isn't their home Bible study. This is just some neighbors in our neighborhood, and we want to make the church walkable. What if we made the church walkable? And so in my neighborhood of Northwest Longmont, in the smaller part of my neighborhood, the actual area where I live, there's about 20 families that could all kind of connect. And so 3 times, we met once a month this summer, and here's what we did. We said, we want you to do 3 things together. We want you to eat together, which always seems to be something we can do as a group. We want you to pray together, and we want you to encourage each other about being good neighbors. And so we met the first time, and when we did, there were about 6 families who came. We ate together. I met 2 families that come to LifeBridge that I recognized them, but I did not personally know them. And so I got to know their name, I got to hear their story, just in my own little neighborhood. The second time we went, there were 4 additional families that showed up. And one of those families had said, hey, I kind of quit going to LifeBridge about 4 months ago, not really sure why, but thought I would come today because their one neighbor had invited them to come. In that one, someone also shared some personal thing that they had going on. Kind of a layer got peeled back, and as a group, we all prayed for them about what was happening. And the third thing that happened was someone was sharing what they were doing as a ministry in their workplace. They're a doctor, and they had invited some people to come in the emergency room where they work. They said there's only 3 Christians in all of the 60 people that work in the emergency room, and they've got 27 people coming to a Bible study one morning. So we prayed for them about that. We've been eating together, praying together, encouraging each other in our own little neighborhood. This last meeting we just had was a couple weeks ago. Again, some additional people came. It was a good thing. All of us walked, which was amazing to me. Nobody had to drive. It was really 4 blocks was the furthest anybody went. And not only, again, did I meet some people that I didn't know very well, but then they started talking about a couple neighbors in one of our neighborhoods near us, a couple blocks away, who had some needs. And they started sorting out how they were going to help their non-Christian friends. And then 5 of those homes all hosted on the kickoff of the NFL. Denver Broncos were playing the first night. It was a Thursday night. And 5 of the homes invited all the neighbors on their street to come to their home, have chili, watch the game, and hang out. And here's what I want you to know. This is not for us. I have no idea where all this is going to land, but already in the 4 months we have been doing these neighborhood groups, in the month of August, we had 214 of them meet around our city. We probably connected with about 1,800 people in our church. And if all we did, if we stopped right here, the pastoral care stuff that's come up for us has been substantive. Just connecting with the connected. We're not even started with connecting with the disconnected yet. But connecting with our own folks in their own neighborhood has created some opportunities for neighbors to care for each other. Here's what's happening since it'll be 2 weeks this coming Thursday. So we're still early in this. We're just a week into this flood thing. Every one of the neighborhood pastors connected with the homes in their neighborhood by Saturday morning. And we had the needs of our own church family surfacing up. And so here's what we're doing. We're doing cleanup stuff and help and working with all the major relief organizations to help our city. But we're starting with the folks who come to LifeBridge who are part of our church family. And then we're connecting also with any of their neighbors who need assistance. And then we're going out broader to the broader community who we don't have any connection with. And our goal is really simple. What would happen if you were the best neighbor your neighbor ever had? What would it look like if you prayed for your neighbors? Not that they would become Christians. We hope they do. But you pray for them because you are a Christian. And so in my own neighborhood, I've been praying, God, help me connect with my neighbors. Because I'm the guy who leaves early in the morning and comes home at night, hits the garage door button, and I don't see. And it's been amazing the opportunities that have opened up in the last 4 or 5 months of connecting with my neighbors. I'm a terrible neighbor. I mean, people in my neighborhood like our family because of my wife, but otherwise with me, they could care less. I'm just the only hope for me is Jesus was in his neighborhood 30 years before anybody knew he was there. So there is still hope for us in all of this. But one of the things we wanted to do was what would happen if we really did intentionally focus on what it meant to care for our people. So I want to do a real quick exercise with you for just a couple minutes. I want you to take, if you got a piece of paper, or just do it mentally in your head, but it's much better if you do this on a piece of paper. We call this the sheet of shame, by the way. I want you to just draw a rectangle and carve it up into 9 boxes, okay? A rectangle and just carve it up into 9 boxes. And then put an X in the middle box. And that middle box will represent your home. Or if you're over here at the university, it represents your dorm room. Okay? And then here's what you should do. In those other 8 boxes, write down the names of the homes around you. However your neighborhood is configured. If it's not right next door to you, who are your 8 closest neighborhood homes or rooms? And write down those people's names. That's the first thing. When we did this as a staff and an eldership, here's where I failed right here. I want you to feel good about yourself. I could not come up with more than 2 of my neighbors' names. I've lived in this particular neighborhood for 13 years. Ow. Because I'm the guy that does, hey. That's it. Yo, bud. Because that's fair, right? I don't know if his name's Bud. If it is, I really get lucky when that. So now I can tell you, we've been doing this as a staff and leadership for 18 months. I know the neighborhood names of the 8 people around me. I know their kids' names. I know if it's a couple. I know the husband and the wife. If it's not, I know who is in that home. Here's the second thing. Write down something about that neighbor that you know. Something about them. They moved here from Johannesburg. He works at Ralph's Plumbing. That doesn't count if he drives a Ralph's Plumbing truck and it's sitting out in his driveway. That doesn't count. Write down something you know about them. All 8 of those. I didn't even get to this part of it. I still was stuck on the names, okay? I didn't even get this far. Then here's the third thing. Go around and write something about them, some hope or dream or hurt they have. My neighbor John across the street. Second marriage, struggling with a teenage son who is not his biologically. I didn't know that 4 months ago. June, down at the corner. Husband died 2 years ago. She's 74. And she has the early stages of dementia. And her kids are really struggling with what to do. I didn't know that about June 8 months ago. We call it the sheet of shame because the truth is we're lousy neighbors. What would happen if the church here, what if we were the best neighbor our neighbor ever had? What would happen in your neighborhood? What would happen as we do a better job of connecting in our neighborhood? What would happen if we loved God and loved our neighbor? Not just our neighbors in our workplace or just our neighbors that we hang out with because we play some hobby sport with them, or because I have relationships like that, and those are important relationships to me. But what if I physically, in my own neighborhood, was actually a good neighbor? What would that look like for me? What if I saw the assets and strengths of my neighbor and not just the things about them I don't like? What would happen if we're starting here with the LifeBridge families, but honestly, this January, we've got 10 other churches in our community that are going to participate with us in a series we're going through out of the book of Acts, and talking about what would happen if the church really did those things that we saw happening in the book of Acts, and a lot of that was being good neighbors. And so I'm looking forward to when we connect the other Christians in our neighborhood with the other Christians in their neighborhood. And what if they prayed for that neighborhood? And what if they were active in that neighborhood? And what if they were intentional about living gracefully in that neighborhood? What would happen if the Big C church actually showed up? And it wasn't just about my own turf, the LifeBridge turf. What would happen if we got our own folks more engaged in praying with other Christians in their neighborhood for the neighbors in their neighborhoods who aren't followers? What would happen if we actually created ministry that was going on in the neighborhood? My hope is that 5 years from now, that the church facility is more of a resource center for ministry than it is the place where ministry happens. Because if we're not careful, most of the ministry that goes on is actually going on within the four walls of our church, and then we're doing some other stuff to be kind of helpful out there. What would happen if that shifted for us? What would happen if my neighbor John, who was struggling with this teenage son that's not his biologically and trying to sort out what to do, what if his first thought was, hey, I need to connect with God somehow in this, and knew that there was a ministry resource opportunity for him in his own neighborhood, and not that he had to go find one of the local churches down the road and go into their building to find that for them? What would happen if we could push ministry down and out? And I got to tell you, I don't know where all this is going. I don't know how this is going. I know it's muddy and messy for us. I know there's not this clear path, but I do believe that God's invited us to love him and love our neighbors. And what we hope happens is that we help drive people toward transformation in their lives. This is all kind of for us coming out of the Hebrews 10, 19 through 25, that we connect with God and we connect with each other and we find ways to make an impact. What would happen if, go ahead and flip up just two more slides for me, I think. What would happen, can we scroll up on the slide just one more? If we really found a way that people's lives were being changed and transformed. And I think that happens when you and I get engaged in the stuff going on around us. I think God does some work when it starts squeezing out. A year and a half ago, I was speaking for a conference in Virginia. And when it was done that evening, they wanted to take me to this old farmstead place for food, for a restaurant. It was this wonderful place. I mean, it was one of the kind of places where like George Washington had eaten there, you know, our first president. And I mean, it was this, and those places have comfort food, and I'm a comfort food guy. And the people who owned the restaurant were friends with the guy that was taking me there. So they were bringing out the food. And I mean, we ate fried chicken and meatloaf, and there was this ham and bean thing. And I mean, they brought out so much stuff that at the end, it was all I could do to eat, but they kept bringing it. I would like take a sip of water and eat, and I would like, you know, get that thing going, and I was just like, I was so stuffed. And then they brought their desserts. They had this deep dish baked apple pie thing, and I had to eat some of that, and there was this peach cobbler, and it was but I gotta tell you, when we got in the car, not only was I so sick, I was just so full, I was sick, I was mad. I mean, I was like angry, because I didn't want to eat that much. and I felt terrible. Have you ever eaten like that before when you just feel terrible? I felt terrible. And here's what I find about too many people who attend the church where I am a small part of it, Lightbridge. Feed me, feed me, feed me. I mean, they got their mouth open all the time. Like a bird, I want to drop worms in it. Just see what would happen to them. And it's about it. And here's what happens. If all I do is take it in and take it in and take it in, then I gotta like puke on somebody. And usually it's like me, they do that too. Here's what I don't like about our church. Because if all we're doing is taking it in and taking it in and taking it in, and it's not coming back out somewhere, I don't think there's any change in our life. We're trying to figure out, how do we start weighing people at our church and not just counting them? Because what have we been about? I know for me, it's been about butts and bucks and baptisms. How do we count those things? And we're saying, what would happen if we just counted in a different way? What if we started looking for outcomes, and not just by the number of people who participate in what we're doing? What if we try to figure out, what do transformed lives look like that? And what is the multiple impact of those transformed lives in our community? What would that look like? How do we measure that? Not simply by how many people show up in our attendance, what the size of our offerings are, how we're doing with some of our mission stuff. Those are all important things. Don't misunderstand. We still count all that stuff. But I do know this. We are doing less programs as a church now than we were doing 6 months ago. And we're saying, let's put our energy and our effort around people loving God and loving their neighbors. Let's connect them with each other. Let's push for them to find ways where they're transforming. And there's a whole slew of opportunities for that, so that there might be some impact in what they do. So that they're finding the place for them where they are showing up in God's story. That good thing that God has prepared in advance for them to do. How are they doing that? How are we engaging people in the real world around them so that they're making a difference for Christ? How are we helping that school teacher not figure out that she needs to go be a missionary to some East Asian country, but rather maybe what she does is figure out how she can use what she has in her school for a kingdom impact? What would happen if we just help people elevate what they already care about, that their life is on loan from God, their loves, their interests, their intersections, their assets, their fortune? How is that being used for eternity? Where's the difference that they're making? And so for us, it's simply trying to continue to move our church out into our neighborhood. Do you remember when we got the first satellite images that were coming? There was a company called Earthwatch. It actually started in our city. A couple guys in our church were instrumental in that. Got those first global pictures. I remember when they were doing testing, he would bring them into me, and he would show me like a picture of our church parking lot. It was really cool, because when I was out of town then, I could look for the cars, see if staff members were actually there working when I was gone. It was really a useful tool. And I just remember how cool that was. So we had, we had the Google Earth stuff, right? And then we went to Google Maps. And wasn't that awesome when you could, click on your phone and figure out where you were going, and you had the map thing? And now what do we have? Google Street. In the U.S. right now, they're I don't know if they're doing it here yet, but they're driving down every street with a camera mounted on the car. And now when you click on your map, you actually get a view of that street, and you can see what house you're coming to. And that's what I see happening for us. It was going from Google Earth to Google Maps, and now down to a street level view. And it's simply about inviting people into what I think God's calling the church across the world to today. And that's to get engaged right across our own street, right in our own neighborhood, to get in that stream that's going by our front door, and to create the relationship opportunities to share and speak. We're going to take a few minutes for questions, and that'll be a good stopping spot right there. I'd be glad to share with you what little we do know and are doing about this right now. Great question. His question is, how did we get started with this? And so let me back up a number of years, and we looked for where was there an opportunity for a need, and how could we get plugged in? I remember when we went to the school district and we said, is there any way you can help us? And they said, no, that whole church state thing we got going, we don't see any way you can help us. And then we went to some of the principals of schools and we said, is there any way we could help you? And they said, no, there's really nothing you could do. And then we went to, forgive me if you're an administrator, we went to the people who actually do the work, some of the teachers and coaches, and we found out there was this huge need. There was a huge need for tutoring. There was a need for classroom helpers. And so we simply started providing volunteers for that. And that happened school by school. At one point, I was asked about a year ago, how many volunteers do we have in the public school system from LifeBridge? And the technical answer to that is there are no LifeBridge volunteers in the school system. There are school volunteers that happen to go to LifeBridge. Last year, that number was 603 who were volunteering in some capacity in our schools. What we got early on involved was, my line was this: we raked a lot of leaves for a long time. We did a lot of projects, service, hands-on painting stuff. So find something in your community. I've helped churches of 15 and 15,000 do this. So it is not about our size, it is not about our denominational perspective, and it is certainly not about our geography, whether we're city, rural. It is about there is a need and how do we get help. So whether that's a local school that's down the street from you, or maybe a crisis shelter of some sort, or some other opportunity where you can simply go and say, is there any way that we could help you? And it started out small for us. And we didn't do this as some big banner thing at the church. I didn't do a 20-week message series. We didn't wear T-shirts. We simply started with the people who cared about some of these things and started empowering them to do that. And then we started saying, hey, if you're doing that, we think that's as important as you serving in the church. A lot of times when we say service in the church, what we mean is serve us. We have all these volunteer opportunities, and you need to fill those. And you may be the volunteer of the year for the city, but if you're not doing something inside the four walls of the church, then we often say you're not really doing anything. And we've tried to shift that mentality for us as a church. Another question.
How do you move from engaging to actually making a disciple?
Get Cornay's tape from the last session. And, I wish I could say to you that everybody who is serving has become this sold out, wholesale follower of Christ. And that would not be true. But I have discovered that we seem to experience people grow faster when they serve. We see a much deeper level of growth happening in their lives. Let me give you a silly illustration. Sometime, I think this was now 2 years ago, I'm standing in the lobby after one of the services, and some guy comes up to me and says, would you pray would you give me a prayer? That's what he said. And I thought what he meant was he wanted me to pray for him, because a lot of times in our lobby when people are walking out and they're telling me something's going on, I'll just stop and pray with them in the lobby, and I figured he'd seen me doing that. So I said, what can I pray for you for? What do you need me to pray about? And he said, I don't need you to pray for me. I need you to write a prayer down and give it to me. So now he had my attention, right? So I said, how come? He said, well, yesterday I was helping at the In-Between. The In-Between is a transitional housing unit in our community, and he was there. He said, my wife volunteered me to help out. I'm a trim carpenter. They needed some trim work done. And so I was helping do that. And we provide mentoring there and job skill stuff, and actually hold some Bible studies in this government facility. And it's been kind of cool what's happened at this place. But he was there helping out. And he said, we took a break, and we must have been talking about church, because one of the guys walked up to me and said, you go to church? He said, my life is really screwed up. Would you pray for me? And the guy that was now talking to me on Sunday morning I said to him, dude, I don't know how to pray, but I'll get one and I'll be back. So now here he is the next day wanting me to write a prayer down for him. And I said, you don't need me to write one down. You got one in your heart. Let me just help you give voice to it. And here's what I know. Guess who's paying attention the next time we're talking about prayer in a service? Guess who maybe went down to our bookstore and picked up some book on prayer? I'm convinced until it starts getting pushed out of us, grow. But there's a whole path we have for people to grow spiritually and get engaged. But it does happen with what Cornée was talking about today of one person connecting with another person. Another question.
Yes, I just want to ask about connecting in your neighborhood, reaching out to your immediate neighbors. If many of them are active members of other faiths, if you have any advice on reaching out to them.
Yeah, we'd end up connecting with people who go to other churches, and certainly we end up with people connecting with other faiths. And we simply continue to invite people to be a good neighbor to those folks, to have a chance to talk about why they believe what they believe, what grace has done in their lives. And we don't do this. This isn't done as an evangelism strategy. It's not being done as a strategy for evangelism. It's being done as a relationship builder, which almost always provides the opportunity to talk about faith. It's because there's strength in the relationship. You know, every life has cracks in it. All of us. You do, I do. There are things about us that we manage around. There's those cracks in our life. And whenever there's any tremor or pressure put on that crack, all of a sudden there's a need that gets exposed. Right? The flood that just came through our area is providing already a lot of opportunity to have spiritual conversations with people that just a week ago weren't too interested in having spiritual conversation. And so we're after the relationship piece to this. This isn't how do we host something in your neighborhood so that we can get out our two questions, right? We always have the two big questions that everybody wants to ask in the U.S. You know, if you die tonight, do you know where you're going? And why would God let you in heaven? All right? We make it all about destination. We're trying to see it a little bit differently than that. Here's what we did. We did exactly what I invited people to do in our church. You know what? Pray. Ask God to give you some opportunities. And keep your eyes open. And over the last, now for me, it's been a year and a half we've been doing this. I've been amazed how many opportunities. They were probably all there before. But I wasn't looking for them, but I do believe God's provided a number of those. And so we've ended up with meals and doing other things. Halftime for me, it's if I see somebody outside and I'm just coming home, instead of going inside, I walk down and say hello. And it's a relational process, obviously, of connecting. But I think we try to make it programmatic, and it's really not programmatic. One more. I'll do one more. I did that one short. Yep. What he's asking about is there's opportunity to do humanitarian stuff and doing humanitarian stuff and not do outreach stuff. There's a long answer to this, but let me give you a couple of short things. One of the things that we decided to do when we said, hey, let's get involved. So this goes back 16 years ago. We decided that we weren't going to try to make it a one-all event. Okay? So in other words, we didn't simply go out and serve, clean up a school, clean up somebody's neighborhood, get involved in resourcing something, and then get our little flannel graph presentation of Jesus out at the end and feel like we did our deal if we could kind of close the deal then. We did see it as a long haul piece, intentionally as a church. And so for us, it was very much about creating relationship and getting the opportunity to talk about it. But if we're not careful, we end up just doing good deeds. But as a church for a long time, actually for about the last 40 years in the U.S., we were more about just good news. And I think good deeds and good news go together. In fact, what we've discovered is that it's a show and tell thing. Instead of just telling, let's show what this means. How do we create connection? And that good deeds create goodwill, and out of the goodwill, we get to share good news. So we're intentionally talking to our people. So this morning, in fact, it's probably happening right about now, or maybe an hour or two ago, 7:30 in the U.S., in Colorado. We'll have 1,500 volunteers, I think, is what's coming this morning to help go clean out homes. So we'll get some training about what to do and what the toxic things are, because there's a lot of issues around that. They're going 5 or 7 people to various homes homes all over our community. And one, not only did they pray together this morning, but here's what we asked them to do. We want you to do a simple thing. When you get there, introduce yourself if you don't already know to these people. 2, say to them, is there anything else we can help you with besides the cleaning? And 3, say, we're praying for you, and is there something specifically we can pray for you? And before you ever get into the sidewalk of their street, you're praying for that home before you get there. And so for us, that's intentional about kingdom stuff and not just going in and helping sweep mud out of their basement. But there's a longer answer to all of that. But we decided not to make it about a church thing. We don't wear our shirts. We don't wear our LifeBridge hats. We don't pass out our tracts with our service times. We try to serve. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Pastor Rick.